Hello, welcome to the fourth and final webinar of the Living with Highs and Lows webinar series. Before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping items. First, I want to make sure the audio is working. So if you wouldn't mind raising your hand by clicking on the hand icon in your console, that way I'll know you can hear me. Great, thanks so much. It looks like everything is working. A few quick items. Due to the number of participants, all attendees are muted, but we encourage you to submit questions and comments at any time using the question box. We'll compile them and share them during the question and answer session later in the webinar. This entire session is being recorded and will be posted to the webinar webpage where you registered. And lastly, we have included a few polls throughout the webinar in order to get a better sense of who's joining us today and get your feedback on some of the team's ideas. Those responses will not be attributed to individuals, and we hope to hear from you. So with that, I'll turn this over to John Calwart, Program Director of the Emerging Opportunities Program at the Grant Sustainability Institute.
Thanks, Maggie. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Just a few brief introductory remarks before we turn things over to our presenters for today. We're so pleased to have so many folks join us today. We had over 175 people register for this from 18 different states and 2 provinces, mostly from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ontario. And glad to have a diverse set of participants with us today from First Nation and tribal organizations, local, regional, state, provincial, and national government offices, NGOs, industry, and many interested citizens. What I'll be doing today is providing a little bit of background for this project that we're doing on water levels and adaptation and through this integrated assessment. I'll briefly present our introduce our presenters for today, and then we'll save some time at the end for questions and discussion, and at the very end we'll turn it back to the presenters to see if they have any final comments. Just a little bit about this overall project in case this is the first time that you're joining us. This is the 4th and final webinar in this series. All of the sessions have been recorded and are being posted to our website, so if you missed any of the previous ones, they're all there for you to join, and this one will be posted in a few days too. Each one of these projects has looked at a specific location within the Great Lakes where there has been work by a research team in partnership with local communities around a particular challenge that has developed based on lake level variability. This overall project is looking at what are things that we can do to develop policy options and management actions to adapt to current and future variability within Great Lakes water levels. Now, during the first webinar that we did last month, and also an event that we had last May, there's lots of additional background information on what is actually happening in terms of water level variability within the Great Lakes, both in terms of the data that we have and in terms of how communities are responding or what are the issues that have been identified. So we're not going to go into that broad kind of overview at this point, but just to let you know, on the website, either from the first webinar that we did on November 10th or the event that we hosted last May, there's lots of really good information there if you're looking for more kind of the context and the background on lake levels within the Great Lakes. So what we're trying to do is come up with this set of adaptive strategies that help protect the ecological integrity, economic stability, and cultural values of the region. This project has had a very place-based approach, given that each of the funded research teams has been working in a specific location, again, with partners to both think through what are the challenges and what are possible options and strategies. But we're hoping that through this very kind of place-based approach, we're going to identify opportunities that perhaps could be used in other areas throughout the Great Lakes region. And then just a little bit about our timeline. We started this about 2 years ago and had a group of teams complete 6-month planning grants, first to determine if they could move forward with a more in-depth analysis of work in a particular area. The first phase of that more in-depth work took place about a year ago, and the 4 teams kind of did background and synthesis reports looking at the status and trends, causes and consequences related to lake level variability in particular areas. Those 4 teams have just completed their phase 2 reports, in which they have identified with stakeholder input various policies and options for dealing and approaching, responding to lake level variability. And so each of the webinars has focused on the work of each of the 4 teams. And then after this, we're moving into the final phase where we're going to take the work from all 4 teams, kind of pull that together into a final comprehensive report that should be available next spring. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the presenters for today, and we're fortunate to have several folks with us. Professor Richard Norton from the University of Michigan, Zach Ravel, also from the University of Michigan, and Katie Sieb from LEA to talk to us about developing land use regulation and infrastructure policy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Norton. Should we do the poll first?
Oh, why don't you sort of introduce the team and the topic, and then we'll launch the poll when you're ready.
Okay. All right. Welcome. This is Dick Norton at the University of Michigan. I'm the principal investigator for this work, and just to kind of give some quick background, this is part of a larger effort we've been working on for several years now with a multidisciplinary and multi-university team working with folks from the School of Natural Resources and Environment, Urban and Regional Planning Program, and then Michigan Technological University, especially my colleague and good friend Guy Meadows up at MTU. This is particularly interesting. I understand there are folks on the call who are not from the Great Lakes. So one thing you should know is the Great Lakes are not tidal bodies of water. So ocean or Great Lakes coastal issues are a little bit different than ocean coastal issues. However, the Great Lakes do fluctuate pretty substantially over time. So we do have periods of high water and periods of low water. The difference is there over the course of decades instead of twice a day. And that creates some really unique challenges for us as we work on shoreline coastal issues and community resilience. Our goal is to develop methods that coastal communities can use to fold better management of their shoreline areas, their coastal areas, into their regular master planning processes using data that are generally available and methods that would a typical planning staffer or planning consultant would be able to adapt and use. So that's how we started this whole process. Oh gosh, I should have moved the slide. Look at this slide. That was what I meant to have on as I was talking about that. This is just quickly our presenters, and then Guy Meadows, the other co-PI for this particular work. What we're doing now is building off of work that we did earlier with some stakeholder communities to help develop master plans. And we're going now the next step down, which is to say, given the policies that the communities adopted through their plans, how can we start to translate that into real on-the-ground regulatory approaches, maybe amendments to zoning codes and or infrastructure policy. So I want to stop here and ask a poll question. And how do we do that, Kate?
There we go. Now it's launched. So the question, Dick, you might want to provide some perspective on this, is we're asking folks to describe sort of their perspective on nearshore development, whether it should be supported, discouraged, or whether you haven't decided or don't have an opinion. And that's sort of an overview of kind of how people might come at this issue. Is that correct?
Yeah. So folks, I like to say people like coastal areas are interesting to study and plan for because people like to build in exactly the most fragile places. So we want to build and enjoy the nearshore environment, but that also creates unique challenges. And so the bind we find ourselves in, the conundrum is, do we encourage and support nearshore development for all the good things it produces? Do we try and maybe dissuade nearshore development because of all the potential harms and other problems it creates? Or what do we do? I don't know. So we thought it'd be interesting to jump into this by getting your sense, your participant sense on where you land on that.
Yeah, so about 3/4 of you have voted, so we'll keep it open for just a couple more seconds. Okay, great. Let's close that and take a look. Looks like pretty strongly, sort of the group lean, 70% of you responded that you think development should be discouraged. About 13% of you it should be supported, and 70% haven't decided yet or no opinion.
Okay, well, maybe we'll see after the presentation.
Adjust your presentation.
You changed your mind, yeah.
Great.
Okay, so I want to turn over now to our colleague, Katie, who's working with LEA, the Land Information Access Association, this has been a collaborative effort where through LEA, we've been working with communities to develop policies at the same time that we're kind of researching how we're doing that and what comes out of it. And I thought Leah or Katie could maybe speak for just a minute about what we did with Grand Haven and how we're building on that work.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. I think the master plan process was about 18 months where we took a really good look at the coastal dynamics in Grand Haven and worked to integrate that into the community master plans. We have 2 jurisdictions that we're working with in this project and in the master plan process, and that's the City of Grand Haven and Grand Haven Township. And so the plans that resulted from what we called the Resilient Grand Haven Project, you can see the logo up there on the slide, the plans that resulted were joint, where the communities worked together to plan for their common area. And so the unique approach that we took was to integrate this concept of resiliency, coastal area management into a master plan, which typically doesn't consider those issues. So it was a nice opportunity to bring in this team of experts looking at coastal analysis. We also, built a lot of relationships in those communities that we were able to build on as we moved into this work, where we're focusing on implementing some of those ideas that came out of the analysis. So the benefit of doing the master plan process heading into the integrated assessment is that we really solidified a knowledge base in the community about changing water levels and why it's an important issue to tackle.
Super. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so building on that, we've been working with both the city and the Charter Township of Grand Haven. Most of our work has been with the planning staff. We've been meeting regularly with the planning commissions for both jurisdictions, and then also with other folks representing the community. We have kind of presented ourselves in June to say, remember us, here we are. And then what we've been doing is kind of incrementally building on ideas. We first went to them and say, okay, what are the key issues that you want us to focus on for this next stage? And we've been whittling our way down with a little bit more detail. The end product here is not for us to give them, here's what you should do to solve these problems, but rather to develop a range of options that they could adopt and kind of a pros and cons assessment of each of the options so that ultimately they get to decide. It's their community. They get to decide which of the options we've crafted makes most sense to them and go forward with, or maybe even some kind of modifications of the things we proposed. So that's where we're heading with the communities. Over time, what we've done is honed in on a series of particular issues that the communities are most concerned about, or that we've kind of brought to the table because of our interests. So for both the city and the township, we're honing in on identifying and coming up with policy options to deal with high-risk flood areas, to better address stormwater management issues, and especially through the idea of engaging low-impact development options, and then also address nearshore coastal hazards. And it turns out for the 2 communities, because of their physical settings, coastal hazards are a little bit different. So we'll focus especially on the city's North Shore area, and then talk briefly about the high bluffs that the rest of the township has. And then a really interesting issue that's popped up through our work with the township is how to deal with coastal dune areas and fire hazards, particularly because there are a lot of coastal dunes in the township. So what I'm going to do is step through these issues one by one. I won't spend too much time on high-risk flooding areas, but I will tell you that one of the things that we did for the master planning effort was to create a scenario-based planning approach. So the idea here is to identify potential futures based on potential changes to climate and what the impacts of those climate futures could be spatially. So what are the areas that are at risk from either flooding or high energy waves given different conditions that these communities could experience in the future? And we're trying to come up with a range of possibilities because there's so much uncertainty. And there are really 2 dimensions to that uncertainty on the Great Lakes. One is, where might the lakes be at any given time in terms of their lake level? Lake Mission in particular can fluctuate up to 2 meters, 6 feet over time, which is a huge amount of difference in a standing water level. So that has a real impact both on the near shore, how much of the land on the near shore is at risk from high energy waves, and then how much of the inland riverine system is at risk for flooding given on changes in water level elevations. When the lakes are high, they push more water into the river. We combine that for planning purposes with then policy options. So each policy option and climate future created a scenario that we then evaluated. What we're doing here now is building on these climate futures. So just quickly, we have a lucky scenario. That's when lake levels are low and the storm's not too bad. An expected, we call that an expected climate future when lakes are pretty close to their long-term average and you get something like a 100-year storm event. And then kind of the worst case perfect storm scenario when the lakes turn out to be high and you get the 500-year storm, which is increasingly becoming more like the 100-year storm. So what we're showing on this map are the areas in yellow are the areas you would expect to get flooded under a lucky condition. So there's still a lot of land area. That's also including the river systems themselves. But there's a lot of land area that could be affected. The kind of burnt orange color is where are the land areas that you might expect to be inundated during an expected future climate storm event. And then the red is what might you expect to be hit by high energy waves or flooding during a perfect storm event. So a lot of our work that we'll talk about builds on that. We'll be working with the communities to develop some policy options for particularly inland flooding areas, but I'm not going to focus on that for this presentation because I want to move on to the other issues the communities are especially worried about. Both communities identified stormwater management as an issue of particular concern, and their interest in adopting low-impact development approaches to address stormwater management. So here's where I'll tell you, there's a lot of text on these slides. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but you can go back and study them once the webinar is posted to get the detail. Basically, low-impact development includes both non-structural best management practices, BMPs, and structural BMPs. These are just some examples of non-structural BMPs, and they really boil down to disconnecting impervious surfaces. That's what a lot of it is, protecting your natural areas and disconnecting impervious surfaces so that you're trying to control stormwater on site as much as possible. A lot of the work we're getting, by the way, is coming out of some Cogs design guide for low-impact development, which is available on the web, and it's a wealth of good information on low-impact development. These are just some examples of structural BMPs that communities might adopt. And structural means they're constructed land features that, again, are designed really to catch and retain water and slowly release it back into the system. It turns out that the state of Michigan is moving forward with its MS4 program. MS4 is EPA's, I always have to spell this out, Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. It's basically trying to control non-point source pollution through a permitting system. Because the state of Michigan is moving forward, the Ottawa County is also moving forward to develop a county-wide MS4 ordinance that all of the communities in the county will have to comply with, including both the city and the Township of Grand Haven. So in effect, they're already having to take a number of steps to move forward on their stormwater management and do a lot of things that you would want to do for good stormwater management. So that we call that level 0. They're going to have to do that anyway. And building on some work, it turns out both the city and the township already do manage stormwater. They've got ordinances in place or public works requirements. So with the help of the engineering firm that works for the city, we've already identified just initially some things they're going to have to do to come into compliance with the county's MS4 program. And then this is just to give you a sense of how we're presenting options and pros and cons analysis for the community. So level 1 might be beyond what you're going to have to do to comply with the county regulations. There are additional things you could be doing to kind of go the next step. So there are some things, for example, in the Cogs design guidelines that the county, for whatever reason, isn't picking up and pushing forward. So we will identify for the communities, here are some of those extra things that you might take up. Another thing that we found through our work with these stakeholder groups is how much the MS4 program is really going to compel communities to have their planners start talking to their public works folks in a way that may not really be happening. So again, in these communities, there is some amount of communication that already takes place, either at the planning staff level or sometimes in a broader way. But to deal with stormwater management, you're getting now into the realm of land management, planning kinds of issues that really are going to require another level of coordination and integration. So the level 2 effort is to really set up a formalized system to do that. Have regular meetings, integrate your planning, analysis, site plan processes in a more consistent way, and then make sure that you really are doing everything you can to get developers to incorporate low impact development into their communities. The third option is to go the full step and create a stormwater utility program. So there are legal issues here. In Michigan, you can create them, but you have to be careful not to turn them into a taxing entity. You can only, they have to be well developed around really controlling stormwater development and assessing fees that are designed just to do that. For all of these, when it boils down to it, the benefits of all of these are improved management of stormwater, improved governmental actions and operations because of the increased coordination, maybe the ability to assess fees that help pay for some of the extra burden and cost. All of the costs, the cons in all of these are the extra work that's required and the potential for some political backlash as people don't understand why are you doing this, why are you adding these extra regulations, so you kind of have to work through those. So again, we're presenting this mainly to show folks the kind of way we're framing options and pros and cons analyses that will be more fully developed in the reports that we give to the communities. The next option that we've been focusing in on coastal hazards. And here, again, this is where the Great Lakes are really interesting because when lake levels are low, coastal hazards don't seem to be so pressing. When they come up, oh my gosh, all of a sudden now the water's lapping up on the porches of these homes. How do we deal with that? And these communities are aware of that and are struggling a little bit to figure out how do we make sure that we're adequately addressing that. One thing I'll mention is the state of Michigan has state regulations that require permitting if you're below the elevation-based ordinary high water mark on a Great Lakes shore. And there are legal issues so that are a little bit complicated, but I'll just tell you right now it's an elevation-based standard above sea level based on the International Great Lakes Datum. DEQ issues the permits. They do it on a case-by-case basis. So far as I know, they don't go out and do a whole stretch of shoreline and say, here's where the ordinary elevation or watermark is. We've gone ahead and done that. So on this slide, the kind of orangish area is where we think the elevation or elevation ordinary high water mark, say that 5 times quickly, is landing on the beach. And what that means is if somebody wants to build lakeward of that orange line, they have to get a state permit. If they want to build landward of it, they don't. But that also means they could be building in risky areas, and it's up to the local community to say, are we going to do something to try and regulate that? And that's the issue we're dealing with. This slide is also showing the current setback. This is for the city, north of the Grand River Inlet, and it shows the setback line that's established that's based on the property boundaries. It has nothing to do with the physical features. It's a property boundary-based setback requirement. And then the black dots are basically the location of current structures. So at this point, the other thing I'll show you quickly is this is a close-up of the high-risk coastal hazard areas that I showed in an earlier slide. So now you can really see there are areas that are at risk from, in a perfect storm event, from high energy waves and inundation, and then even in unexpected storms. There are areas here that are at risk. So what we've done now is identified different sets of options, options for how you figure out where you want to draw a setback line, and then options for policies that you might adopt once you've established a setback line. At this point, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Zach, who's going to just walk through quickly the different options for setting this, for identifying setbacks.
Hi, everyone. The maps you're looking at currently show the current North Shore setback of 25 feet from their lot line. Dick mentioned this a little bit earlier. We accomplished this by using aerial images, and we georeferenced these images in ArcGIS and overlaid the North Shore, the 25-foot from lot line setback boundary, and the building footprints. The 25-foot setback line was a fairly easy ArcGIS task. We just did a buffer around the lot line and found out where that would be. As you can see, the 25-foot setback line implicates about 3 of the 70 total North Shore properties, meaning that they abut the line already. This also means that there are quite a few properties that could move lakeward over time.
Another piece of this to notice, right now the way the city setback buffer works is if your neighboring properties are closer to the shoreline than you are, you can scoot your property forward to kind of balance it out. So there's kind of a built-in possibility for these structures to keep inching their way forward towards the ultimate setback over time.
So these set of maps show the same standing water conditions, and instead of the 25-foot setback line, we have used the state of Michigan's methodology of determining where the 60-year erosion line falls landward of the zone of active erosion, which is on the shoreland where it is 583 feet. And what this shows is that, and this is a better view of this, and what this shows is that there are a number of properties that are either abutting or actually beyond our estimated 60-year erosion line, 23 in fact. Same process for determining the lot line here. Next slide. All right, and for this slide, we have drawn the previously discussed perfect storm high hazard flood zone line. Similarly, this implicates a number of properties on the North Shore, about 16 in total. And this is for average water conditions, this map.
So I'll just mention here, now when we presented this information to the city's planning commission, we pointed out that these are different options for how you might set your setback line, and they all have pros and cons. The pros for both of these are that they're based in science. They're scientifically, they're spatially fixed based on what we know about dynamics. The downside is it's still a highly complex system with lots of uncertainty. So one of the benefits of the 60-year erosion line is it's a fairly straight line that's easy to interpret. One of the benefits of the perfect storm is it's telling you what are the properties that really could get knocked off the block if the right storm came. But it's kind of a squiggly line. How do you show that on maps and show that to people? So one of the things the community will have to do is, one, do we even want to adjust our setback line? And then if we do, which one do we pick and why, and how do we make sure that it's well justified? But this is an advance, because we're now using physical dynamic systems, it's an advance beyond just saying, well, it's 25 back from the property line, and there's really no clear reason why we picked that number except for some safe distance. Okay, having adopted the setback, now the communities have different policy options they might adopt premised on having established the setback line. So one, and we've identified 4 for the community to consider, giving kind of a range of things they might engage, but noting that they're not mutually exclusive. So they could do any or all of these or some combination. They are no new structures lakeward of the setback. So basically we're going to allow things to continue to be there, but certainly not let people build in more hazardous places. One might be to allow some structures lakeward of the setback, but make sure they really are truly movable. This is kind of in parallel with the state's high-risk erosion area program. If you're within a certain distance of a high-risk area, you have to have a movable structure. I don't know how much the state, some of the structures that I've seen are in these areas don't look movable to me, so you would probably want to be really careful to designate what does it mean to be movable and ensure that. A third option might be to say, okay, any structure that is now lakeward of the setback, we are going through our zoning ordinance to declare this is now a non-conforming structure. And legally what that means is it would be allowed to continue. If it were damaged by a fire or something, you might be able to rebuild it. But if it were damaged by a storm event to a substantial degree, if half of it got wiped out by a storm event, now you have to take the rest of it out and you can't rebuild it. So basically, it's a way to make sure that structures that are already in high hazard areas aren't allowed to continue if they really are damaged because of a coastal storm event at some point in the future. The final option is one that we haven't really talked about these with the communities, and we're still kind of working through the legal implications of this. But the idea would be to require a surety bond. So for the structures that are lakeward of the setback, we're pretty sure at some point those structures are going to go into the lake. Erosion is happening. The lake shoreline is going to continue to move. At some point, the right storm is going to come along and severely damage these structures. Right now, there may be a limited opportunity to have the owners of those structures have to pay to help clean up the mess that's created. Maybe a surety bond would be a way to help ensure that those funds are in place when that storm eventually hits. And it also may create a disincentive for folks to build really big structures that are going to create lots of harm because they know they're going to have to pay for it when it gets there. These are all difficult and potentially contentious policy options, so we thought this would be a really good place to have a poll to see what you all think. So actually we have 3 questions, and what we're going to be asking is, for each of these 4 policy options, no new structure, movable structures only, non-conforming uses, and surety bonds, the first question is, which do you think is likely to be an effective policy? The second question is going to be, which is the most fair, or which do you think is fair to the property owners? And then the third question is, which do you think is fair to the community? And they're not exclusive. You can pick any and all that you think apply. Did I do that right? You
did that just right. So we're going to try to go through these 3 back to back. So it looks like about 1/3 of you have voted on this effectiveness question. You can select as many as you think would be effective. Keep this one open for about 5 more seconds. Okay, let's close that one and let's take a look at it. So it looks like in terms of effectiveness, prohibiting new structures, 73% of you, and then 1/3 for movable structures, 44% for non-conforming use, and 42% for surety bonds. So that's effectiveness. Let's go on to fairness for property owners. So again, you can select as many that you think would be fair to property owners. That's about half of you responding. Just a few more seconds. All right, let's take a look at the responses on this one. This is more even. So 59% think prohibiting new structures would be fair to property owners, 52% movable structures only, 65% thought establishing non-conforming use provision, and about 60% of you with the surety bonds. So that was with property owners, and now let's take a look at what you folks think in terms of fairness for the community. Great, that's half of you. And that looks great. So we're going to close this one up. So a little different. So 82% say prohibiting new structures is fair to the community, a little bit more. Movable structures, 23%. Non-conforming use, 57%. And surety bonds, 64%. So it looks like the first couple were a little different.
Interesting. Yeah. Now we're going to have to cogitate on this and see what this means. So thank you for participating in that poll. This is really interesting. Cool. Okay, with looking at the time, let me just keep going. This is just to say, it turns out the township is in a little bit different situation from the city because virtually all of the township shoreline is characterized by bluffs. So it's a little bit harder to anticipate a perfect storm kind of wave event because when a bluff goes, it goes in a large chunk. It's not like water's running up over a sloped shoreline. So in reality, the setback options for the township are to either use a property line based setback or maybe a 60 erosion line. That's a best guess erosion line. So this is just to say we're also working with the township on this kind of a setback policy option approach as well. The last issue I want to talk about today is one that's popped up especially with the township, and it has to deal with the states or with the coastal dunes. A substantial chunk of land area in the township is state designated coastal dune, critical dune area. And what that means is that the landowners in those coastal dune areas who want to build have to get permits from the state. A couple of things have happened. I'll tell you quickly. One is that the state a couple of years ago amended the state Sand Dune Management Protection Act such that communities cannot adopt protective laws that are more stringent than the state. So it's pretty liberal, frankly. It lets property owners build, and it basically tells the communities you have to let them build, with some protections that the state puts in place. But it arguably is not as protective of the dune systems as it was before that amendment was made. At the same time, the state also regulates other effects to the dunes that might have negative impacts, especially access roads, the placement of things like water protection lines, and the removal of vegetation. What's happening in the township especially is these coastal dunes very quickly climb to some altitude, and they're heavily vegetated. The roads leading up to some of these areas are really narrow and windy and dangerous. The township has been constrained in how it can place infrastructure lines, fire lines and such. And so they're kind of caught in this bind where they can't stop development from happening, but they can't fully accommodate it for fire safety hazard reasons because of the infrastructure they would need to do that. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we, given the regulatory situation that we're in, how do we make sure that we're providing adequate fire safety and protection and preventing wildfire? So again, this is a lot of land area. The purplish areas here, just to show you, are currently undeveloped parcels that are located within the critical dune, state-designated critical dune area. There's a lot of land that could be developed. These blue parcels have already been developed, but the purpose of this slide is to show you there's a lot of land area that could be further subdivided, probably. And even though it's technically developed, there's a whole lot of more development that could take place. In fact, that's the upshot. There's a whole lot of more development that could take place within the township's coastal dunes. And then this is just repeating what I just noted about the struggle that they're confronting. So the township is pretty content that the state regulations are adequately addressing coastal dunes health and systems. What they're really worried about is the fire protection issue and how do they deal with that. We did some legal analysis to find out, does the township actually have a duty to serve? And based on our review of constitutional, statute, case law, it looks like the answer is no. Realistically, the township could declare these areas in the dunes that are really hard to get to, that in fact are putting our fire safety and rescue personnel at risk if we try and get up there quickly, is problematic, and therefore we could declare that we can't guarantee for you folks living in those high-risk areas that we're going to be able to provide fire service, fire safety emergency service. So that means 3 options that we've been showing to the township for them to consider is to, one, just do what you're doing. And they have acquired some special equipment. They've got a special small fire truck and some other equipment that allows them to get up into these areas better than what a traditional fire truck would do. And they've got some plans for laying hose in a quick way if they have to get up. But they've really kind of reached the limit on what they can do. They could arguably seek permission from the state to widen the emergency access roads or remove vegetation, but that's a problematic policy option because that will undermine the health and stability and functioning of the coastal dunes, and the state may let them do it. They may not even be allowed to. So the third option we're exploring in some depth is the idea of designating a fire hazard overlay district, and basically informing residents in those districts, we'll do our best to get to you, but you need to know that we may not be able to reach you in case of a fire. If it's putting our fire crews at risk, or people are, we can't get up there because everybody's trying to get out at the same time, those kinds of concerns. They might also look into increasing their current requirements in terms of what's required for fire suppression in those structures. So we're exploring all of those things. So that's the kind of the policy options that we've been considering. Just the conditional considerations. How well is this transferred to other coastal communications? The bottom line is this is all very transferable, especially to communities on Lake Michigan, especially those that have coastal dunes, where they're struggling with the same kind of tension between dune health and safety, fire safety issues, and the pressure for development. Very much, really all of these issues transfer quite well. On the Lake Huron side in Michigan, the shorelines tend to be shallower, so they've got bigger flooding issues. They may not have the kind of dune bluff kinds of issues that we're dealing with on the Lake Michigan side. Really, the way that we're going to implement all of these things is through continued coordination and communication between the departments and the adoption of tangible and meaningful policies, and that's how we'll measure success. What have they adopted, and how well is it designed to try and get at the goals here? And I mentioned this at the front of the talk, and I'll just finish off with this. All of these options require good technical analysis, a little bit of work, a lot more coordination. They could have real benefits in terms of keeping people out of harm's way and protecting natural systems. They raise really contentious issues and the potential for political pushback because you may be constraining what folks can do with their private property. And that all along has been the thing that we're struggling with in these really dynamic and fragile systems. So I'll stop here and open the floor for questions.
Let's wait.
Oh, I forgot to do it. Yeah.
Well, we'll get there.
Okay.
You guys continue sending in your questions and comments, and we might sort of go back and touch upon some of these issues. First, Dick, it sounds like there were a couple, Dick and Zach, there were a couple questions about how you identified some of those lines that you used in terms of the perfect storm line and the erosion line. So the first question had to do with how you identified that perfect storm line. Is it the 500-year flood line or wave action line?
So I'll talk a little bit more about this. Our colleague Guy Meadows at Michigan Tech used observed Great Lakes storm data and basically compiled what an average storm would look like for the expected flooding conditions, and then for the top 2% storm, so the 500-year storm, for the perfect storm conditions. And we used the elevations of the standing water level and the total storm surge from that and overlay that basically on the elevation of the landscape to figure out spatially how far inland that would go.
So it's our best estimate of standing water levels plus wave run-up plus storm surge in a 500-year storm in terms of flooding.
Right.
It would be the perfect storm. It really would be like the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Great. There was a similar question wondering how you identified, there were two questions about how you identified the erosion line. And one person followed up asking, so why choose a 60-year erosion allowance as opposed to, say, a 100-year erosion allowance? Structures can last for well over 100 years in their lifespan, so 60 years doesn't seem to correspond with the expected life of the different dwellings.
Yeah, honestly, I'll answer that question and turn over to Zach. We picked the 60-year because that's what the state's high-risk erosion setback.
High-risk erosion area program uses a 30-year and a 60-year setback option.
Yeah, so we picked the 60-year just to be consistent with that. But the commenter's right, that any community could really stop and think about that and say, what do we want to use as a setback that's reasonable given the life of these properties? There's a little bit of a legal myth here. The typical mortgage is a 30-year mortgage, and so the thinking is someone will build a house, it's a 30-year lifetime of the house, and then it'll go away after that. Well, that's not true. I live in a house that's much older than that. But those end at the 30-year and the 60-year have become kind of standards that people use, I think because of the typical mortgage life. But again, any community could pick the setback that they think is appropriate given the age. And then how did you do the
state has a methodology for determining where they draw the line lakeward of the zone of active erosion. And the zone of active erosion for Lake Michigan, so that was the community we're working in, they're different for each of the Great Lakes, given their different dynamics. So for Lake Michigan, that was 583 feet on the shoreland. And then from that line, there are different landward extents depending on how quickly that part of the Lake Michigan shoreline is eroding. For this particular part in Grand Haven, I believe the setback from that zone of active erosion was about 116 feet. So that 60-year setback line is 160 feet from the zone of active erosion, which again is 593 feet.
So again, we're getting all this data that it's the erosion rates were established by the state based on studies they've done. So all of the data that we're using, I should say most of the data we're using is readily available online through data sources. And we have we'll mention this, I guess I'll mention this now. We have a website called resilientgreatlakescoast.org, all one word, resilientgreatlakescoast.org, where we lay out in greater detail the methods we've been using to draw these lines on maps and how a typical planning staffer who's got some basic understanding of GIS can take the methods we've got, know where to go to find the data sources that we're using, and develop the maps that we've developed. So the only data that's unique here is the work that Guy Meadows did for us to do updated estimates of wave run-up. And I think that the plan is in the works to try and get that published in some way as quickly as possible.
Great. And then just to let you folks know, if you're interested in going to that website, when we post the recording of today's webinar, I'll also provide a link so you can get straight to that from the same place where you see the recording. Sort of take things in a different direction, there is a comment about fire consideration and safety. So I think we have enough time to actually do another poll to get some more feedback from you folks on those issues. So the comment, and this is from somebody who is along the North Shore of Lake Erie in Ontario. Their comment is that for fire consideration for dwellings in their area, their fire services have basically stated that if structures are within 10 meters from the top of the bluff, they will not risk their firefighters or equipment, as putting water on a fire located in an unstable bluff could cause a catastrophic failure.
Please send me the details. That's really good to know. It's great to have an example of a community already doing this. So whoever that commenter is, if you could.
Yeah, if you want to just send, if you're okay with getting in touch with Dr. Norton, if you just let me know via the question box, I can connect you guys later. If you're not, that's okay.
That would
just
be
let
great.
me know.
Yeah, thank you.
And then sort of getting back to that, Dick, it looked like you wanted some feedback on the different options related to safety.
That would
so
be
why
great.
don't we go, since we have time, let's launch those polls.
It's basically the same three questions. For the three options we talked about, no additional action, fire safety approaches, which means wider roads and removing vegetation, and then a fire overlay hazard district. We'll ask you, which do you think is most effective, which is most fair to property owners, and which is most fair to the community?
That's about a quarter of you. Okay, just a couple more seconds. Let's take a look. Looks like 10% of you thought no additional action beyond what they're doing would be effective. 50% thought the fire safety approaches, and 78% thought the overlay district. And so then let's look at this in terms of fairness to property owners. Okay, that's about a third of you. Okay, make your final selection, and let's take a look. So the fairness is sort of somewhat similar. 13% no additional action. A third of you thought fire safety approaches would be fair, and 53% thought the overlay district. But then let's sort of think about the fairness in terms of the communities more broadly. Just a few more seconds to make your final selection. Let's take a look. So very different here. 5 and 7% for no additional action and for fire safety approaches, and 88% for an overlay district.
Wow, that's
so
really interesting, yeah.
Real difference there. Any initial thoughts, Dick, or do you want to?
Well, it's an opportunistic survey, but I'm going to share it with the communities.
I think maybe this is sort of, I think it's interesting the questions that you wanted to ask the audience is really getting at this issue about the distribution of costs and benefits.
Well, it's cost and benefits and fairness. I mean, it's not really, there are economic considerations here that can be captured in a cost-benefit assessment. And there are technical issues here about how do you justify technically where you're drawing lines on maps, especially when you draw lines on maps. That's when things get heated and contentious. But really, at the end of the day, so much of this is about considerations of fairness. And how do we balance fairness to the private property owners and what they got when they bought that property and how they want to use it against larger considerations for the community about the ongoing ecosystem and health of those places, and also the risks and the cost to the larger community when a big storm comes. How do you deal with that? So yeah, this is really interesting to see these results and how we're kind of struggling with that.
Great, and someone wanted to add, or talking about the overlay district, they noted that a hazard overlay may or will affect the residential property insurance coverage and sort of a consideration.
Yeah, so I didn't mention this, but it's in our conversations with the township especially, we were pretty much struck by how little attention the insurance companies seem to be paying to properties they're insuring along these shorelines. So at least the township officials weren't aware that the companies were doing much to investigate how risky these properties were really and whether or not the premiums that are being charged are appropriate. And so one of the benefits of mapping a high-risk zone and maybe even requiring a surety bond is that would kind of tip to the insurance companies, hey, maybe you ought to be taking a closer look at the insurability of these properties. I will mention, on the other hand, frankly, a lot of these properties are owned by very wealthy folks who might be in a position to self-insure, which is to say they don't bother to get insurance, they're just going to take the risk. And if they lose their house, they are wealthy enough to rebuild it or to take that loss. And so there is kind of an equity consideration here about if you kind of pursue that route, you may be creating a situation where only the wealthiest of the wealthiest can really afford to live anywhere close to a shoreline because they're willing to self-insure and take on that risk. That's an issue. We really haven't talked with these communities, but as we've been exploring these policy options, I've been chewing on that in the back of my mind. So in fact, that would be a wonderful thing. If anybody's got thoughts or comments for me on that issue and how to approach it, I would very much welcome any thoughts you might have on that topic.
Yeah, and just let folks know if we don't get to your question or comment during the webinar, we will be sharing all this information with Dr. Norton so that he can think about that, incorporate that in, or if there are any unanswered questions, we're going to be putting together a master FAQ document from all 4 of the webinars, and we'll be posting that on the webinar website, so you can always check back there for an answer. We'll put you on the hot seat one more time. We have a question about the prohibiting new structures option. So given the information that development is allowed within critical dune areas, and further that local units are unable to be more restrictive than state regulations, how could a community implement a no new structures policy if that's the option they wanted to pursue?
Within the critical dune area specifically?
I believe so.
Another piece of research we did was to ask if there are other valid reasons to restrict development that aren't related to coastal dunes. Could a community do that? And we couldn't find any cases on point to speak to that directly, but because we were thinking about it in terms of there may be good fire safety reasons to not allow new development. If a community were to say no new development because of fire safety reasons, would they run afoul of the Sand Dune Management Act? I don't think so. I think if it's a reasonable regulation based on some other reason that's a valid reason, then they could restrict development. But you would want to be careful not to do that clearly for the sake of protecting the coastal dune, but just pretending that it's a fire safety hazard reason, right? Because any court will look at that and say, you're just being sneaky and getting around the Sand Dune Management Act. But we didn't really talk about this, but the township could conceivably prevent or greatly constrain new development for fire safety hazard reasons through a fire safety hazard regulation that's not coastal dune specific. And that's an option actually we should explore a little bit more before we finish up our work. Beyond that, if a community really wants to slow down or stop development in their coastal dunes, the state designated critical coastal dunes, they're going to have to lobby the legislature, the state legislature, and change the act. Because my reading of the act right now is they're greatly constrained. I will point out too, there are coastal dune systems that are not part of the state designated critical designated areas, and so they have more flexibility there to regulate those dune systems because they wouldn't run afoul of the state act in those places, but they need to know where those are. And like any regulation, you have to have a good basis for what you're doing, and you definitely don't want to completely disallow development because you may be setting yourself up for a regulatory takings claim.
Great. Let's see, we have another sort of comment. This is again coming from Ontario, noting that there's a road within their jurisdiction where banks will not provide mortgages on, so just won't, and that it's in a high erosion area and a storm damage center, and so they're not sort of sure how insurance companies would deal with that. So
yeah.
From the lending side as well.
Yeah, that would be great too if we could get more details on that. That would be helpful.
Great. We have a question about, so bear with me folks, reading and talking at the same time. Do you have any thoughts as to expanding sort of the options or the pros and cons to communities regarding the placement of shoreline structures to combat the loss of high bluffs on the Great Lakes with known varying water levels? So thinking about breakwaters protecting many of the properties versus individual landowners seeking armoring or other solutions.
Yeah, so here's where I'll fall back on my coastal engineering colleagues and say don't do it. for two reasons. One, as soon as you start building hardened structures, you're screwing up the shoreline movement, the movement of sand along the shoreline, and you're almost surely going to affect your neighboring property owners as your structure affects the replenishment of sand in those stretches. So you can work your way down the coast and see pretty clearly where people have put in armored structures because it interrupts the natural shape of the shoreline. So there are issues there about property ownership and all of that. The other reason not to do it is because ultimately you can't beat Mother Nature. If you build hardened structures, you're setting yourself up for an ongoing battle with Mother Nature as the lake tries continually to scour away the sand around those structures. And so this is a painful thing for property owners to hear because you built a house, you like your setting, you don't want to lose it. If we want to promote the natural movement of shorelines, then hardened structures are problematic. The other option, too, frankly, is the community could decide, no, we want to protect the houses, we're going to allow armored structures. And then what they're setting up is you're not going to have a beach, or at least for long stretches of time, all you'll have is a rocky shore face as the lakes come up high and they scour away the sand. So again, it's not a technical issue. We know if you put hardened structures in, it's going to change the dynamics. It's a policy, legal, ethical question. How do we balance property owners in their established homes against the community's right to have a public trust beach?
One more? Okay, great. So those were some really great questions and comments, really added to the discussion and the presentation today. We've got just a few minutes left. I don't know if Dick or Zach or Katie, anybody of the presenters have any final comments you'd like to make before we kind of wrap things up today?
No, again, I'll just reiterate, we're trying to do this work in a way that we can build a website that gives communities the ability to do better coastal area management planning with readily available information, or information that could be collected with a minimum amount of extra work. You probably want to do that in the context of all of the issues your community is struggling with, right? So one thing we found from working with these communities is they're interested in their coastal areas, but that also is part of a larger community planning effort. So it makes sense to link them as best you can in that larger effort. And then at the end of the day, have fully inclusive collaborative planning processes that allow you to get these really difficult policy, ethical questions on the table and debate them, and then decide as a community where you want to go within the limits of what the state or the federal government will let you do because of their interests. But it's do the best with the facts that you can get from and the analysis that you can do that's possible to do that, it's available. But then you're just in for some difficult conversations with your community members about how do we reconcile these competing interests.
Thank you. Just finally wanted to thank the presenters for today. I want to thank my colleague Maggie for making everything run so smoothly. And then a special thank you to the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality Coastal Zone Management Program for financially supporting 2 of the 4 project teams, and also for providing financial support for this webinar series. With that, Maggie, any final things you wanted to mention about next steps or how folks will get access to the presentation?
The presentation recordings will be on the same website, which is where you registered. So the recording will be there. You'll get an email letting you know that it's been posted. And for any of you who sent individual comments, I'll make sure that Dr. Norton gets those. So thank you so much for sharing your questions and comments.
Great. Thanks again for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.